what do you think is the role of communication to preserve biodiversity and ecosystem services?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that. I mean, policy is about being able to communicate what needs to be decided and for actors to negotiate amongst each other what the policy decisions will be and the actions that flow from that. And that's where I think, the communication of what is real is really important, and the implications of making certain decisions, and that there are shared responsibilities, or it's a shared space. I think in the past, when populations were small, the economic systems were much smaller than they are now. People could always move somewhere else, or you could always, farm somewhere else, something like that. But the world is full now. There's no free space anymore. And so we really need to understand the consequences of our decisions on other people and realize that it's a closed system now and we've reached the limits of it. So how do we try and balance a lot better?
Hola. Antes de pasar con esta nueva entrega de conversaciones de poder ambiental, quiero aprovechar para recordarte que Poder Ambiental es un espacio que busca cada vez hablar más y mejor de medio ambiente. Y para lograr eso necesito que me ayudes con una cosa, y es que nos sigas en nuestras redes sociales. Nos puedes encontrar en TikTok y en Instagram como @poder.ambiental, y nos puedes encontrar en YouTube y en Spotify como Poder Ambiental. Si nos sigues, es más fácil que cada vez tengamos mejores invitados para tener mejores conversaciones. Recuerda, lo ambiental es poderoso y lo ambiental es político. Muy buenos días a la gente de Poder Ambiental. En la mañana de hoy me encuentro profundamente honrado porque estoy aquí con el doctor David Obura. Antes de empezar, quiero contarles un par de cosas muy brevemente. El doctor David Obura es biólogo de la Universidad de Harvard y tiene un doctorado, es decir, un PhD de la Universidad de Miami en corales. En términos de experiencia laboral, solo para mencionar unas pocas cosas, el doctor Obura fue asociado senior de conservación en el Acuario de Nueva Inglaterra, hizo parte del Blue Ribbon Panel de la Asociación Global de los Océanos, es el director del grupo de especialistas de corales de la Unión Internacional de la Conservación de la Naturaleza, UICN, es el director de Cordio en East Africa, que es el Centro de Investigación de Costas, Océanos y Desarrollo del Océano Índico, y actualmente es el director de el IPBES. El IPBES, que es la plataforma intergubernamental de la biodiversidad y los servicios ecosistémicos. Es decir, esta es la entidad científica más importante del mundo en términos de biodiversidad y de servicios ecosistémicos. De manera que es un honor tener aquí al doctor Obura. Doctor Obura, welcome to Poder Ambiental.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Dr. Obura, before we begin, I understand that you wanted to mention that you are talking as an independent scientist and not representing IPBES.
Well, I just wanted to clarify, thank you for this. I wanted to clarify for the audience that while I'm the chair of IPBES, in a podcast like this, of course, there's a lot of issues that are covered by our assessments and our sciences, and I'm very passionate about talking about them. But of course, it includes my interpretations from my own background in Africa and as a sustainability scientist in coral reefs about the importance of the work that we do and how it should be used in decision making.
Perfect. Okay, so in order to begin, let us start about the report. What is the Nexus report and why is it important?
So the Nexus report has a long title. It's about the interlinkages between biodiversity and then water systems, food systems, health systems, and the influence of climate change. And we were tasked to do this by the country members of IPBES. And the reason they did this is because of the multiple challenges that we face in biodiversity loss, in climate change, in pollution, the development challenges. We've really realized over time, after IPBES's global assessments released in 2019, that these are all very much interlinked challenges and we need to address them together rather than the old way we have been acting, which is in silos. So typically, in our countries, we have ministries that deal with biodiversity of nature, separate ones for water, separate ones for food or for health. And we really need to deal with the dependencies of these sectors on one another. So nature really supports all of these sectors that we use in our economies and our societies. We get multiple benefits from these systems, but then there are trade-offs as well. We can't always maximize all the benefits, and we need to deal with them all together. So we try to address that in the Nexus report.
And I mean, understanding that we handle the information in silos, how complex it's to find the information to interconnect them, because what's the complexity around that?
Well, so it's a big challenge to find the information to connect these challenges together. So one of the things that we did in preparing the Nexus assessment that the authors did is we did searches of the scientific literature. And the thing is, many studies are done just in health, or just in food and agriculture, or just in biodiversity and conservation. There's a growing number of studies that maybe look at the linkages between food production and in agriculture and biodiversity loss or natural systems. But then the words that they use for those two systems can differ between different sciences and between different countries and languages. So finding the information that addresses all of these multiple challenges is really challenging. And then, of course, when we look at two-way interactions, you get a certain amount of studies. When you look at three-way interactions, there's less. Four-way interactions, there's even less. And so what we try to do in the assessment is to look at the literature that deals with these together, but build a synthetic picture to help us understand, even beyond these five, what's the complexities of dealing with these systems together, and how can, if you have an interest in a certain sector, maybe in transport or something like that, how can you learn? We didn't look at that, but how can you learn from what we found in the Nexus assessment to look at interlinkages in your own area as well?
Okay, yeah, because it's and also understanding that it's a study that takes place on a global scale, and institutions understand, as you were mentioning, information in different ways. So how long does it take to develop a project like this?
Well,
Roughly.
it takes a long time to do the report. The authors, the scientific team, basically meet for 3 years. Most of the writing is done in about 2 years, 2.5 years, and then another half year to condense the final steps in the summary for policymakers, which is what the governments look at when we present it to them in our plenaries. But even before that 3 years of the scientific process, it actually takes about 3 years to really develop the idea for the assessment report. So the countries deciding this is a top priority, and then we write basically like a précis or a summary of what it may be. Then we get a group from around the world together to really write a more detailed outline, and then that outline, once it's approved, tells the scientific team what they should focus on. It helps us choose the scientific team as well. So altogether, this assessment takes 6 or 7 years from start to finish. So it's a very long process and a lot of negotiation and dialogue between the policymakers on the one hand and then the scientists on the other hand. So we make sure they're talking together very well.
Okay, so very complex export. Yeah, it's a process that is very complex. Let's see some of the results, and let's start with the economics, because the economics has a feature and that everybody understands economics. So if you could help us understand some features of what the report says on why biodiversity and ecosystem services are important within the economy.
Okay, so what the report does is it makes some findings that, it looks at the literature, and depending on how you quantify the value from the economy, you can have a range, but really people have found about 50%, 50% of our global economy is directly or moderately dependent on nature. So that means the foods that we grow, the water that we drink, many of the products that we use in our manufacturing, the the wood or the concrete in our buildings and so on. So this tangible sort of resources from nature really support about 50% of the global economy, and the other 50%, maybe in arts or in digital economies, may not be directly dependent on nature. But of course, if we don't have the part that is dependent on nature, none of the rest happens. So ecosystem services are really the foundations of what humanity has, what our economies and our societies need to live and to grow. So it's critical to understand the economics of biodiversity. And unfortunately, at the moment, our economic systems have ignored that dependence, have externalized the costs of using nature, pretending they don't exist, or let somebody else pay for it somewhere else or later. And now what the assessment reports are saying is we have to internalize those costs. We have to work out how we make sure we fully pay for what we're getting from nature, and to help nature, to sustain nature so it can continue to provide those benefits.
Okay, so on internalizing those economic flows, there's a part that is very interesting that says that there's $7 trillion that are directed towards harmful incentives towards biodiversity, harmful. And there's only 200 billions invested in biodiversity. I understand budgets as the reflection of what an institution considers it's important.
Yes.
What do those figures tell us about biodiversity?
Yeah, so you've hit it spot on. I mean, in a word, those figures tell us that biodiversity is not valued as highly as it should be. I mean, as you said, we spend about $200 billion directly in biodiversity. There's another 200 billion perhaps in, what could classify as nature-based solutions, or really investing in helping nature, provide benefits to people, that is not focused on biodiversity, that is focused on the benefits. But then 7 trillion is, is a lot more than that. 50 to 80 times more, up to 100 times more. And that's what that 7 trillion says is what I mentioned before. We've basically externalized those costs. They are incentives or encouragement to business to not be concerned about the impacts on biodiversity. And until we equalize these levels, so the 7 trillion, what the Convention on Biological Diversity says is we must reform harmful subsidies. So our economic systems work with subsidies, but instead of them being harmful to nature, invest them in sectors that can promote nature and be beneficial for nature, at the same time as supporting jobs and the economies that we need. So we need to really shift things so that 7 trillion, the equivalence between is brought down to zero. All the subsidies should end up being neutral or positive for nature as well. Then we'll really build a nature positive economy if we do that.
Well, and I personally think that the economic system has this problem, and that value it's assigned right now and not in the future. And it's something similar with age and health. So I'm 45 right now, so I'm learning about the importance of exercise, and I think that having a good environmental quality, it's like having a good health. And investing in health when you're younger is cheaper than paying doctors later in life when you are older. I think that's the same, because that's something that the report says, that it's cheaper to act right now and conserve and preserve nature than later, because it will cost a lot of money.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I mean, I'm a bit older than you, so I've already came to that realization as well, and invest in current health because of how important it is. But in a way, our economic systems are perverse, because what our economic system does, it depreciates costs in the future. It says they're less important than now. So So companies, delay expenditures because spending something for future benefit isn't worth it compared to spending something for current benefit. We need to, in a way, have a positive appreciation of impacts on nature, because especially now that our economy has grown so much to cover the whole planet, and our footprint, our economic footprint on the planet is larger than the planet itself, we need to reverse these equations, I guess, so that we're reinvesting in nature. We're putting money back into nature. The money came from nature initially. All value has essentially come from extraction from nature in the past and then built up from that. We've taken it too much out. We need to put it back into nature. So what the report says, if we delay expenditures on nature for 10 years, it will double the total cost for about 10 years. Now that's a projection. It could end up being more than that, particularly if there are catastrophic impacts from climate change and things like that. You can make specific estimates. We have an estimate of 500 billion per year for addressing climate change as the minimum we should be spending, things like that. If we don't invest in these, it sounds like a lot of money, but if we don't invest these amounts now, it will cost more in the future. And I think the economic systems need to shift to fully understand that. And I think they're what I hope that we can show from IPBES's work, showing the true value of nature, is that we'll understand that our economic systems work by spending money, by creating jobs, by there's purpose there. If we invest in things that improve the future, it's not money lost. It's not a cost. It's actually an investment. So all that money will be spent in investing in better conditions rather than a cost in reducing impacts.
Of course. There's this other question that has to do with the future. I had a conversation with a mental health specialist the other day talking about eco-anxiety, because people feel helpless nowadays because all the information regarding the environment. So the Nexus report has several future scenarios that reflect different pathways that humanity could take. Mm-hmm. So in order to give people, because we could always give bad news, but if you could point out a couple of scenarios that you could spot on the Nexus report that make you hopeful.
Yeah. So that's very important point. Is that so? One thing the assessment team did is they looked at existing scenarios in the literature that look at the future of these 5 elements together, or where we could interpret, the state of these 5 elements. And they came up with 6. There are 6 groups basically of scenarios that scientists and companies and others have produced. The ones that are closest to today's practices, what we're doing now, one is basically called nature overexploitation. And when you look far into the future, you can see that by undermining nature more than it is today, we have negative impacts across the board on nature, on food systems, on health systems, and on climate as well. So that's basically increasing those costs. There's a food first scenario, which is, say, prioritize food production, which of course is very important for the global population, the number of people we have now. So you can achieve an increase in food production, but if you do it too narrowly, there will be costs for biodiversity and water and climate as well. So that's as a result we found from the literature. But there are very positive stories as well, and particularly, and all the positive messages come from looking at these sectors together, at interlinked and nexus approaches, not at siloed approaches. And basically those say that depending on how you prioritize, whether it's nature or water or food or health, climate change, or dealing with climate change, you can achieve positives across all of those. Of course, some will be a bit more positive than others, but you can achieve positives across them all. You just have to invest in the interlinkages and in the joint, we called it nexus governance planning, where you're really looking across these sectors together rather than looking at any of them in silos. So there are very positive messages from this, but it takes balance across multiple sectors. And it does take a more equitable approach amongst people, ensuring that nobody has too little means that some people have to give up having too much because we are on a finite planet. So they're good stories, but it does take investment from all and commitment from all.
Dr. Obura, for example, in terms of energy consumption, because that's something that the world is facing right now with the entering of AI, these data centers are handling a lot of information and it demands a lot of energy. What's the trade-off that humanity is making in there, or what? How does this report inform that decision?
Yeah, so the report didn't address directly energy as a sector. We were not given that mandate by the countries to do that, except in the context of climate change, because climate, of course, is an energy systems issue. And so, so I say that the I guess findings from the report would point in two directions. One is, what is the total amount of energy that is really needed for different sectors such as AI? Should the energy consumption be so high to enable AI, or can it be done in ways that use much less energy? And then what is the source of the energy for supporting that? Of course, and the top priority for success in any of this is direct climate action. So, ending our dependence on fossil fuels and shifting to renewable energies. But then which renewable energies, what is the cost and the impacts of the different sources in balanced ways? So we have to work that out. So the report doesn't deal with that directly, but this is sort of interpreting from that myself.
Okay, and the trade-offs also they entail decisions, because, for example, if I eat a hamburger today for lunch, then I would need to exercise tomorrow, and I am the person who makes that decision. But when we are talking on a global scale, that becomes very complex. And I think that that's what the report underlines on governance. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on that, and what are the challenges surrounding that?
Yeah, so one of the challenges we've had as IPBES is that our past reports, the global assessments and others have been very high level. They're global assessments, they're addressing national policymakers on the whole, because those are our primary members. But decisions have to be made every day by people on the ground, in local governments, even within national government systems. We need all of these decisions to be consistent with one another. So a couple of things. We're hoping that in the Nexus assessment, one, we address very tangible response options, the authors called it. So what are the responses that can be made to have positive outcomes for these 5 sectors: biodiversity, climate, food, water, and health? So how can you identify, if you're in the food sector and you're growing food, what's the response options that you have available to you that can have positive benefits across other sectors as well? And that's down to the local scale as well. So individual decisions by actors day to day, the decisions they might make investing for 2 to 3 years in something, or maybe government policies for 5 or 8 or 10 years, how to make all of these coherent with one another. And the important thing there is that we have a conceptual framework. So the system within which we're operating needs to be consistent, so that when you understand the system, you know that if you make certain types of decisions, they will be coherent or consistent with decisions that are being made by somebody else in the system, in government, or a competitor, or a partner. So your actions are supporting one another rather than working against each other. And that's really critical for moving forward. I think the system is so complicated that we need to have this alignment around our understanding of the system and what it's saying, so that we know that we can make coherent decisions and not be undermined by the decisions of others.
Dr. Obura, do you see, because what you were mentioning about the complexity of the system, the world, it's a living entity and it, it's too much, and the connections and all of that, but there is the possibility of AI allowing us to model some of that complexity. Do you think that through that we would be able to improve these governance systems in order to be able to establish these connections
Yeah.
more explicitly?
Well, so I mean, AI can assist us a lot because it can deal with levels of complexity that we're not able to in an explicit framework. It can always help decision making, but I think technology is never the solution in all of these, big challenges that we face. It's really the value system and the decisions that are made, the choices that are made that are critical. And I think one thing I've picked up from, becoming more and more embedded in IPBES's framings, from working on the assessments to now being the chair, is that what we explain with our conceptual framework, with the Nexus assessment, is very tangible to people on the ground. If you are you're the head of a household, you have your own household, you have a small company or a farm, you're dealing with complex decisions all the time, balancing your water needs, your energy needs, how much money you have, how many mouths you have to feed. It's very real, and people understand that at their scale. What we need is to get coherence so the whole system understands those sustainability needs and operates in that direction. I think the sustainable development paradigm, the sustainable development goals are a good attempt at framing that overall system, but we still need to provide decision makers with a lot of help to make the right sorts of decisions within that. And that's where I think the Nexus assessment findings and other reports from IPBES, they help with understanding the interlinkages and dependencies that we need to address and the trade-offs that we need to address so that we achieve more benefits rather than achieve a benefit here but with a big harm somewhere else.
Okay, and in order to get that, I think that people need to understand what is important and then to transfer that to policymakers and all that. So I understand the policy nexus as a communication tool
Mm-hmm.
that needs to be that needs to inform policy making. What do you think is the role of communication to preserve biodiversity and ecosystem services?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that. I mean, policy is about being able to communicate what needs to be decided and for actors to negotiate amongst each other what the policy decisions will be and the actions that flow from that. And that's where I think, the communication of what is real is really important, and the implications of making certain decisions, and that there are shared responsibilities, or that it's a shared space. I think in the past, when populations were small, the economic systems were much smaller than they are now. People could always move somewhere else, or you could always, farm somewhere else, something like that. But the world is full now. There's no free space anymore. And so we really need to understand the consequences of our decisions on other people and realize that it's a closed system now and we've reached the limits of it. So how do we try and balance a lot better? But I think technologies can provide huge solutions in enabling, quality of life at much lower cost for energy and materials and things than might have happened with prior technologies. But it's the decisions to use those technologies in the right way that are critical. And policy is all about that, and communicating with one another within a policy framework is critically important.
And the other thing about communication is that IPBES must be supported through a network of institutions that develop the scientific work. Do you think that scientific institutions are doing a good job communicating?
Well, I'm a scientist, so I come from a scientific institution where we try and communicate. But I think your point is apt, is that, you know, all people, whether we're scientists or policymakers or working in a bank, whatever it is, we work within a certain frame. We have a language, we have a jargon, we have a system that we deal with. And depending on our personality and the personality of our organization, we either communicate very well or poorly within that context or externally to others. So I think IPBES's space is that we deal with evidence and with knowledge. So scientific evidence and knowledge are critically important. And we do try and invest a lot in understanding how to communicate it most effectively to have influence. But it's also to get the scientists and policymakers and others to realize that science is not the only knowledge system there. There's indigenous and local knowledge systems all around the world that have very deep understanding of issues in their context, in their space. And we need to find a way to try and integrate as much as possible across these knowledge systems. And that means communicating between them, but with words and concepts that might be completely different from one another. So how do we do that? So I think improving that communication is essential. I think scientific institutions, government departments, you know, some communicate very well, some communicate very poorly, and we have to really try and work out how to do it much better across the board, that's for sure.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Obura. The final question that I wanted to ask you, it's a tradition here in Poder Ambiental. Poder Ambiental translate environmental power. So I wanted to ask you, your own personal definition, how do you understand power and how do you understand politics?
Yeah, thanks. So that definitely this would be from my personal perspective. I mean, I think so. Power is about interrelationships between people, and also people with non-human nature, with other beings in nature, you know, which has power over others. For people, I think it's about trying to make things, or the ability to make things as we would like them to be. So David Obura, what is my belief system? And do I think if mine is, I think it's more relevant and other people should follow it, then I try and, you know, if I have more agency, more power for others to follow that, then I have more power than somebody else who doesn't have that, you know, doesn't have that ability. The key thing is with power is it depends on how inclusive the worldview or the values of the people or the entities that have the power. How inclusive is that worldview of others, and how fair is it to others? Because some are very fair and very inclusive of others. Some are very, you know, are very dominating of others and take from other people. So I think that's essentially, you know, I would interpret that's what power is, and politics is essentially the exercise or the boxing match of that power. You know, which political parties, which entities gain more power in exercising their worldview of others.
Perfect. Dr. Obura, thank you so much for this. I will leave the link of the Nexus report on the description so people can access it, go through it, inform themselves, and talk about it so we can make better decisions.
Yes, I'd love everybody to access it, and we hope that more and more people or networks in Latin America and other places will interpret the findings in ways that are relevant in your context, so that it becomes a lot more relevant to the people in your networks.
Perfect. Dr. Obura, thank you so much for this, and hopefully this won't be the last time. Thank you so much.
I hope so. Bye-bye.